I'm very pleased to introduce the three speakers to the panel Variants and Causes of Crisis in Europe. So we start with Jan-Werner, Department of Politics, Princeton University. Then Bettina de Souza Guilherme, Jean Monnet Network. And Kara, which is from Turkey and has been working in the Center for Southeast European Islamic Studies. So Jan is speaking about, is there really a crisis of democratic representation today? Bettina on, if they don't represent us, causes and impacts and reactions to the crisis of democratic representation in the European Union. And then Kara, existential insecurity and Turkey's exit from democracy. I am particularly interested as past president of IPSA. We are very frustrated not to have our meeting in Istanbul, but right at the moment we could not be part of a congress. We are going to
Yes. Thank you very much. I have to confess, I feel a little bit like an imposter because I fear I might be the only person at this very interesting conference who is a political theorist and who feels slightly reluctant to pronounce on high about variants, causes, and so on and so forth. But I hope instead you'll forgive me if towards the end of my remarks I will rather sharply veer off in a normative direction and provide some thoughts on how we might address solving the crisis, or another, specifically though only in the European context. The crisis of representation. This much used phrase, perhaps overused phrase, can mean at least two things. For one thing, it could actually mean what Wolfgang and Coletta reminded us helpfully this morning, when people really talk about a crisis, a life and death moment. It could mean that indeed the very principle of representation is in decline, perhaps a terminal decline. This, it seems to me, is what scholars mean who argue that we are indeed on the way towards a form of so-called post-representative politics. Personally, I do not share that diagnosis. I think it's very typical that scholars who advance this claim subsume many phenomena under the diagnosis that actually do not necessarily point to a complete break with the principle of representation. If you think about the very slogan, non nos representan, it doesn't necessarily point to a break with representation as such. It is, of course, a critique of who is representing us, or rather not representing us, right now, but it should, I think, not be so quickly subsumed under the idea that we are entering a completely different age. So having dismissed that notion of crisis of representation, let me move to the second possible meaning, which is the perhaps more conventional one, of essentially saying that crisis of representation means, in effect, a critique of the current state of representation. That, of course, seems much more plausible, and even though I promised not to veer into too much of an empirical direction, perhaps you'll forgive me if I at least try to identify three factors, or put on the table three hypotheses, about what might be important factors in triggering this dissatisfaction with the current state of representation. And I'm sure that for many of you, this will not exactly be news. So one factor would appear to be an increasing conflict, or if you prefer a different language, a deepening cleavage between, if you like, ideals of openness and ideals of closure, which I think do not simply come down to pro or anti-globalization, where people subsume that particular conflict far too quickly under just an economic rubric. But for many people, this is still the most important sort of instance of openness and closure, Others would describe the conflict as one between, let's say, globalists, although of course it has become a very loaded term, globalists on the one hand and localists on the other. If there's anything to this thought, it matters in particular because this conflict has the potential to split a lot of existing parties. And we've seen this, for instance, most recently perhaps with the Republican Party in the United States. But it in a sense has the potential to really scramble our party systems in a way that has maybe yet to run its full course. Secondly, and this has come up already in various debates we've had, a deep dissatisfaction with traditional parties. On the one hand, in many of the forms that the late and much missed Peter Mayer identified, we talked about in decline party membership, engagement, and so on. But maybe more specifically, and Dr. Merkel pointed us towards this yesterday evening, the sense of convergence of parties around common programs, hence a sense that we're facing, in the extreme case, a democracy without choices. Or as Chantal Mouffe at one point put it so graphically, the choice between Pepsi and Coke. And then thirdly, and this also already came up to some degree, a not unjustified sense that we are living through yet another profound structural transformation of the public sphere, which of course is directly linked to the topic of representation. It's media representations which also form citizen perceptions, party identifications, and so on and so forth. Now, all these three developments, all these three factors, I think have played particularly into what is very often simply called the rise of, guess what, populism, or what is now often described as the supposedly unstoppable wave, or in the words of Nigel Farage, the former leader of the UK Independence Party, for whom apparently the image of the wave was too small and petty, a tsunami of populism. I think this diagnosis of a supposedly unstoppable wave is profoundly misguided. If you like, we can talk about it in the Q&A later on. But for now, allow me just to put on the table a couple of thoughts about what I think populism actually is, why the three factors I just mentioned may have played a role in strengthening it without thereby asserting any sort of simple causality between these phenomena. And then, as I already promised or threatened, let me end on a more normative note as to, as the phrase used to go, what should be done. So populism, for short, and some of you have had the pleasure, or maybe not pleasure, of hearing this already last night, populism is not reducible to what is often colloquially, in a very cliched way, called an anti-establishment stance or criticism of the past. Of course, populists, when in opposition, criticize governments. But above all, I think they do something else. They argue that they and they alone represent what they typically call the real people, or also very typically the silent majority. Might not sound so bad, not exactly the same as racism, not exactly immediately the same as, let's say, a fanatical hatred of the European Union. And yet, this, if you like, claim to a moral monopoly of representing people always has, in my view, two detrimental consequences for democracy. First of all, populists will then also say that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. And this claim is never just about policy disagreement, which of course is completely normal and ideally productive in a democracy. No, populists always immediately make it moral and they immediately make it personal. The other characters are simply corrupt. They are, to coin a phrase, crooked. What Donald Trump did in the presidential campaign 2015-2016 was, of course, extreme. But I don't think it was truly an exception. I think all populists employ the kind of language that hear when they talk about their opponents. Secondly, and less obviously, I think populists will also claim that all those, if you like, among the people, among the citizens, who do not share their ultimately symbolic construction of the real people, and who logically therefore do not support the populists politically, that all those people might have their status as properly belonging to people put into doubt. Let me illustrate that thought with two recent examples. Many of you will remember Nigel Farage's speech, still during the night of Brexit, when he said that the outcome of the referendum had been what he called a victory for real people. Implying, of course, that the 48% who wanted to stay inside the EU, well, on some level, aren't quite real. Donald Trump gave a speech in May 2016, which, given the sort of other sort of stuff he said during the campaign, was hardly noticed, but which in many ways I think was deeply revealing. He said, I'm quoting from memory, the most important thing is the unification of the people. And all the other people don't mean anything. I hope you can see the point. The populace decides who truly belongs to the people, even if you happen to have, in this case, an American passport, even if you legally belong, the populace can decree that you do not belong. Now, if I may add one thought, and this sort of goes back to also the debate we started to have last night, I believe that populists, even if they don't win elections, can have a detrimental effect on democratic political cultures. I'm not saying, again to clarify a point from last night, I'm not saying that if they end up as minor coalition partners in a government, we should expect, that the Gulag will be reopened and horrible human rights violations will necessarily happen. Not at all. But still, what they do and how they talk is really not how other democratic actors talk and ultimately act. What do I mean? I mean that actually any populist party that doesn't win an election or doesn't get an overwhelming majority even in the polls has an almost logical problem, if what I've been trying to say is correct. Because how can it be that they and they alone are the representatives of the people, and yet they are not in government? So one way to get out of that contradiction that populists often, not always, to be sure, but very often employ, is in effect to take another look at that infamous expression, the silent majority. And what they end up saying is that, well, look, if the majority weren't silent, we would always already be in power, by definition. So maybe we shouldn't be talking about a silent majority, maybe it's a case of the silenced majority. Maybe something or somebody kept the majority from truly expressing itself. Hence, the very frequent, again, not always, but very frequent tendency by these actors to call into question election results. Trump is an obvious contender for this. You remember how in November 2016 he said, well, if I accept the results, if she wins, I'll tell you in time. Of course, everybody understood what that really meant. According to some surveys, 70% of Trump's supporters went on record to say that if Hillary Clinton wins this election, it must have been rigged. I think any democratic political culture where you see these sorts of results has a bit of a problem. Or an example from a country which was about to have a vote on Sunday, Austria. You remember the very contested presidential election there last year, maybe. Eventually, the person who was, in effect, a populist contender, the man of the people, and who lost, which really wasn't possible because the guy who won was an old, green professor from Vienna with dubious ethnic heritage. A man like this, by definition, cannot win against the man of the people. Okay? So, eventually, Norbert Hofer, who was actually, whose portrait was on here earlier today, eventually kind of conceded. But he said something which in and of itself was deeply revealing. And I apologize for the fact that it only really works beautifully in German. He said, the winner, ist gezählt, aber ist nicht gewählt. In other words, he was saying, yes, the numbers add up. Okay, I accept in the end, okay, the numbers lie in his favor, but he hasn't really been elected. Now this is, for those who care about these sorts of references, this is pure culture. This is opening up a division between statistics, numbers, the kind of stuff that liberal democracy does, and a different idea of democracy, where there is some real people out there, an almost metaphysical entity, which can make a different decision by way of acclamation, by some other way that can remain quite mysterious, but that does the true election somehow. And I would simply say that a normal, quote-unquote, democratic politician doesn't talk like this. What these people all end up doing is, of course, communicating to their supporters that our democracies might just be a facade, that there's always something else going on behind the scenes, that elites are manipulating the process, and so on and so forth. Now, to be sure, I hasten to add that, of course, it's completely all right to criticize our existing, let's say, election systems, forms of representation, and so on. There's plenty to criticize. What I'm simply claiming is that somebody who ends up saying, because I didn't believe our system must be bad and rigged, someone like that is offering a ultimately non-democratic version of critique. All right, very briefly, how does this all start relate to the three factors I mentioned at the beginning? So my hypotheses would be the following. The increasing conflict between openness and closure does not predetermine that populists will rise or win or anything, but it's a set of issues where they feel they can say something. Because to some degree, these are questions of belonging and not belonging. If our deepest conflicts were different, if they were, let's say, about bioethics, or if we actually took global warming seriously, it's not obvious, to me at least, that populists would play a very big role in these debates. What would they say beyond don't trust the experts on this question? Whereas in terms of debates that ultimately also revolve around identity, the identity of the people, and so on, they have something to say, which is not to say that they are correct, but they're very strong potentially in those sorts of discourses. Secondly, and this has been said many times before, of course, the convergence of other parties, especially in the form of converging on the so-called third way, I think it's fair enough, paved the way. Because they could advance a claim that was reasonable enough, where they said, where are the people in all this? So we're basically being told there is one reasonable center, and then there are sort of crazy extremists on the left and crazy extremists on the right. So this quasi-technocratic stance, where disagreement, if you disagree with this supposedly unique, reasonable center, you basically reveal yourself as irrational or extremist, because there is one reasonable policy answer, everything else is just sort of crazy extremism. This, of course, makes it easier for populists to say, where are the people in this, where are choices? And just as a footnote, if I may, one of the ironies of developments like this is, of course, that even though then technocracy, for shorthand, and populism look like two extremes, they actually also share one characteristic, because they both are forms of anti-pluralism. Technocracy says only one correct policy solution. If you disagree, you reveal yourself to be irrational. The populist says only one authentic will of the people, and only we know and represent it. If you disagree, you reveal yourself to be a traitor to the people, and so on and so forth. So everything that we usually might think of as democracy, choice, debate, disagreement, the kind of stuff that happens in parliaments, disappears if we end up with just these two extremes. And I think we saw actually precisely this pattern in the context of the Euro crisis in particular. There's increasing polarization between here's one rational policy answer, and then populists saying, but the real people are thinking something else. Lastly, and I'll just allude to this with one sentence, as already we talked about this morning, it's far too early to come up with grand diagnoses about this structural transformation of the public sphere, if indeed it is one. But in a certain way, of course, it might have made it easier for populists to mobilize, partly on the basis of a specific, if you like, anti-professional reaction to supposedly elite journalists. It's become much more possible to connect people who have a reaction against them, for whatever precise reason, than was the case before. I mean, I don't want to get into this now, but if some of you are interested in talking about this, I think it's one of the ironies or paradoxes of our time, that on one level we do live in deeply anti-authoritarian times, where professional knowledge is systematically questioned. But even though it's anti-authoritarian, it's not progressive. And in that sense, it can translate into phenomena like what I'm talking about in terms of populism. All right, if I may, the two normative bits. So first of all, if you find anything useful in what I've been trying to say about populism, one effect perhaps might be that we become more careful in how we understand certain phenomena. And we become perhaps less willing to let some of our leaders, especially but not only in the European Union, get away with basically branding or condemning certain new parties and movements as populists. So you remember, leading representatives of the EU, Barroso, Van Rompuy, and others, basically saying, oh, all these crazy populists, left, right, Podemos, Syriza, Le Pen, etc. It's all sort of the same thing. They're all anti-European. It's all a big danger. This, I think, to say the very least, is deeply counterproductive. Because some of these movements, I think, should be much more understood as potentially being part of a renewal of representative democracy. And very often it's sort of ironic how people basically end up in a position, observers now, not EU representatives, but they basically say, oh, if in Greece you only have PASOK and New Democracy, it's post-democracy, no real choice. Then you have Syriza, and then the people still say, oh, it's crisis of representation because it's an insurgent protest populist party. And you want to say, well, what exactly do you want? I mean, if it's like this, it's a crisis of representation. If it's like that, it's also a crisis of representation. So in other words, the thesis cannot be disproved because there's always something which supposedly conforms to this particular diagnosis. And especially in the case of Spain, which I'm sure many of you know better than I do, so I'm willing to be corrected if this is wrong. Especially in the case of Spain, I think a good case can be made that Podemos has really been part of trying to solve the crisis of representation. That in the old days, you really could say very plausibly, here are two corrupt parties, and they really were corrupt. Not everybody who talks about corruption is populist, of course. If they really were a sort of version of post-democracy, then, young people go out, they protest, eventually some of them form a party, they mobilize people, especially young, highly educated people who basically said bye-bye to the party system, came back to the polls, and most important, when they lost, they accepted it. And that's not obvious. It's not obvious if you think back a little bit in European history that young people, whose, in some cases, life chances have virtually already been destroyed. They're never going to catch up, okay? I mean, after this level of youth employment, even if magically everything turns around, they've lost already so much. That people like this basically dutifully form a party and eventually give loose to consent. You just need to think about the 1970s in Europe to remember that sometimes young people who have deep objections to the existing system have other ideas about what they could possibly do. So that's one thing. I think we should basically be much more careful in how we frame certain new phenomena. Secondly, very briefly, if I may, how should one deal with actual populists, which is to say actual anti-pluralists as they have emerged in many European countries, as they are now in the latest iteration, very present for the first time really in the German parliament. Just a couple of suggestions. So I think by now we've learned, especially but maybe not only, through the European experience, that two very widespread approaches certainly do not work. The first one is total exclusion. So basically the stance where politicians say, we won't even talk to you, if you show up in a talk show, I will not appear on the stage with you, if this party asks questions in Parliament, we will not answer them, we will walk out, this sort of stuff. This clearly is the wrong stance, both on a strategic level, but maybe less obviously on a democratic theory. It's wrong on a strategic level because by taking this position, you of course entirely confirm the narrative which populist parties are always serving up to their own supporters. The elites never listen, there are all these taboo subjects that nobody dares to talk about, etc. But on a democratic theory level, it seems to me also profoundly problematic that especially once these parties are in parliament, if you refuse systematically to engage with them, you essentially deny representation to their voters. And one of the sort of biggest political but maybe also theoretical problems I see is that people are way too ready to infer from the rhetoric of the leaders the character of the voters. We cannot know whether all the voters of populist parties are themselves populist, which in my sense means anti-pluralists. We cannot know that. In some cases, it's a plausible hypothesis, but it's perfectly thinkable, for instance, if you permit a rather cliched example, that somebody says, look, all this stuff that Marine Le Pen says about the other parties, I don't really think it's true. Although, of course, when people sort of, employ their own family and they accept €1,000 suits from, entrepreneurs, you might say it actually is mostly correct. But never mind that. You can say, look, I don't believe in any of that stuff. But you know what? The National Front has a fantastic agricultural policy. And I, as a farmer in a particular part of France, I just think this is my number one policy. So you're essentially denying representation to that person if you refuse to accept his or her party in parliament. The other extreme, the other approach from this is, of course, to put it very colloquially, to run after populists and to, in effect, start to copy them. Again, we're seeing this very clearly now in the German case, where a particular party has said, okay, we made a mistake, we didn't really cover our right side, we need to kind of talk more talk and appeal to people who don't like refugees and so on. Again, on a strategic level, it's very unlikely to work, because the usual response that has been given by many populists in Europe is, well, look, now they're copying us, but the original remains available, why don't you vote for the original? But again, it's also on a democratic theory level that something is profoundly wrong here. First of all, through these opportunistic concessions, you might end up shifting a whole global culture, in the case of right-wing populists, to the right, in a way that has had no proper democratic authorization. So let's say Denmark and the Netherlands end up in a position where I think for good reason citizens eventually say, how the hell did we end up here? This didn't feel like it was a collective choice that we really wanted to be much less friendly to refugees and immigrants and so on. It was basically something that was pushed over time by mainstream parties. And secondly, and less obviously maybe, also this goes back to the debate we started to have last night, very often observers, but also politicians, confronted with populism, switch from a stance where they say, these demagogues, these liars, we don't believe a word of what they say, they have all these simplistic policy proposals, we can basically totally ignore them. They switch from that stance to a stance where they all of a sudden give populists a kind of sociological monopoly of understanding society. So all of a sudden one ends up saying things like, they know people's true sorrows and concerns. Well, yes, of course, somehow they gain traction, because otherwise they wouldn't have increasing shares of the vote and so on. But very often I fear that this stance is based on a profoundly problematic understanding of how democratic representation works in the first place. After all, democratic representation is not like a mechanical reproduction of already existing identities, interests, and so on, objectively out there in society, so that the populists miraculously discover something that nobody else had understood. No, democratic representation is, after all, a dynamic process where the self-perception of citizens is partly based on particular, if you like, representational offerings by politicians, by parties, by civil society, friends, family, and so on. Which is not to say that it's all arbitrary or fictitious, but it's a lot more dynamic and malleable than generally is given credit. So, for instance, you may remember that in many parts of the world, maybe on November 9th last year, people woke up and they said, oh my God, it's the end, it's a catastrophe. But there's one upside. We always knew that America is totally racist, and now they've proven it. 63 million came out and proved to us conclusively that they're totally racist. Yes, of course, there are plenty of racists in the US. But to say that, this is sort of empirical proof that, basically Trump was closing the representation gap for racists, I think leaves out far too many factors of what happened. To some degree, it's true. And through what he was offering, he was encouraging people to see themselves as what you might call part of a white identity. But this is not objective, it's not set in stone, it's changing. Especially when European socialists and democratic parties, sort of behind closed doors, are saying, look, it's terrible, but finally we have to accept that populists have proven to us that workers hate foreigners, and now we're going to have to work around that. I think this is a big mistake. Anyway, if I have one more second, which I may not, one more second, because I told you all these issues. So you might be saying, this guy's not positive to say, especially in the US, because it's supposed to come up with some uplifting, positive, thing at the very end. So where is it? Very briefly. I think there's no alternative to engagement with populist actors. But talking with them does not mean talking like them. So you should have a completely open debate. You should basically, as a good politician, be able to make a distinction between all kinds of topics that can be part of a democratic debate. There's a wide variety of stances you can take on immigration, on demand policy, on refugees, and at least I would not say, these stances are automatically undemocratic. They're not. So there's a difference between openly debating consensus and then hopefully relying on the force of the argument to defeat some of these characters, and moments when populists specifically reveal themselves as populists in my sense of anti-plurals, distrusting the democratic system as it is. So if, for instance, a populist politician says in a debate, there's a secret plan by Angela Merkel to replace the German Volk with Syrians. It's very important that another politician immediately makes it clear that we've now left the territory of normal democratic debate about policy. Now, of course, the populist is not then going to recoil and say, oh, sorry, I didn't realize I was propounding a conspiracy theory. I won't do it again. Unlikely to happen. But the hope is that if you make these red lines very clear, you at the same time communicate to people, yes, there are real choices. You can debate all kinds of issues. But if this kind of talk starts, you as a citizen watching this, listening to this, you're going to have to make a choice yourself. Whether you want to be in the same boat with people who have these sorts of attitudes, or ultimately not, even if you might share some of their policy views. So this might be a pious, naive hope from the point of view of democratic theory, but I think it's the best sort of stance at the level of politicians one can possibly take. We can also, if you like, talk about the level of citizens, but I know that my chair is already hitting me. It's like minus 10 minutes already, I'm sure, so forgive me for having gone on a bit, and we can talk more later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I can have to. So this goes very well with my subject. I'm going to speak more about the European Union and democratic legitimacy. And I chose the slogan "Non me representan," which came actually from not from the populist movement, but from the indignados. So actually. A protest movement, a social movement, and I want to show that actually in the moment of the global crisis, they were actually right, because the crisis management of the European Union was actually one that did not really match democratic legitimacy aspects. And I want to to something that Wolfgang Merkel said yesterday, and I was very happy when he talked about it yesterday. It has a lot to do with broken promises, because broken promises insofar that people were expecting globalization to bring prosperity for everybody. And in fact, they brought prosperity, but not for everybody, and they brought also a reduction or a halving of the extreme poverty in the world. But they brought at the same time, and this is actually a subject that has been in the literature for a long time, inequality. And I remember this inequality for all from Robert Reich, who was mentioning the subject. Joseph Stiglitz was publishing a lot about it. Thomas Piketty in the last years became very famous on it. And what is definitely one of the biggest achievements of Occupy Wall Street is that this subject is now a mainstream subject. It's in the discussion of it's on the political agenda. What is interesting to see is the question, where is the famous trickling down? Because in liberal globalization, you should have, globalization should create the growth, and with the growth, automatic employment and prosperity for all. And in fact, even a few years ago, when I went with the European Parliament to the World Bank, they actually said, in fact, we discovered this does not exist. It doesn't. This mechanism doesn't work like this. It's going to the other direction. Yeah. So, what about the European Union? There's a big frustration with the European Union, because the European Union is a promise. The European Union should be bringing prosperity for the Europeans, for all Europeans, and should protect from globalization. Should help to benefit from the advantages of globalization, but should protect from negative consequences of globalization. Yeah? But in fact, what happened? The European Union transformed itself into a kind of transmission belt for this, what is that, opening. And for liberalization, deregulation. What is interesting, this is like, I have a study from the Eurobarometer of April this year, about designing Europe's future, trust in institution globalization. So there it comes out the majority believe that globalization is a good thing, but 4 in 6 believe also that 4 in 10 believe that globalization is a threat to employment in companies in their country, and it brings increasing social inequality. And they also, the conclusions brought out that the European Union is considered a means to enable citizens to benefit from positive aspects of globalization and to help to protect citizens from negative. And additionally, so last year's Eurobarometer, social equality and solidarity should be emphasized in order to face global challenges, and social inequalities were seen as one of the main challenges for the European Union. So there is a big priority on social equality. So I did this one. Okay, I'm going back. Yeah, if we see here, trust in political institution, you can see this spike of 57 is the trust in the European Union. This was before the crisis broke out. There was a 57% trust in the European Union, which fell down with the crisis. So it is clear that the citizens were deceived in their trust to the European Union. And while actually what is interesting for me too in this, the European Union citizens have more trust in the European Union than they had in the national government and national parliaments. But the loss of the trust was stronger for the European Union. So the deception with the European Union was stronger than with the national parliaments and governments. So I said that the European Union transformed itself into a transmission channel for globalization, because obviously there was the concept of the internal market. So you had for freedom, so you have to transform the economies of all the EU member states into one market. So you open up for goods and services, and you have a very strong control on free competition. And in that way, this led particularly in a sense of freedom of services to a lot of dismantling of public service or universal service. So they were constantly under attack from the European Commission, whether they have to liberalize these services. There were several proposals to come up with a services directive, which would also have seriously undermined social standards in the European Union and also environmental standards. And one that came through, that is actually on the agenda now of Macron, is the Posting Directive. And to explain a little bit, so a company in one of the European member states can send workers for a short time in another, and actually employs them and pays them in his country. Normally, they should be paid according to the country in which they work, but there's a lot of fraud. There's a lot of fraud in that. There have been initiatives to build a social dimension, and this was also during the time of Maastricht, of setting up the Economic and Monetary Union. And two figures were key: François Mitterrand and Jacques Delors. Jacques Delors used to be his finance minister, became then the president of the European Commission. And he actually convinced both the European Trade Union Confederation, that's the ETUC, and I used to work there at that time, and also the TUC about the benefits of the European Union. So he said, and that was the time of Thatcher, look, brothers, the way to defeat Thatcher is to do it through Europe. So if we can mobilize to make social regulation in the European Union, you get it through the back door to the UK. And he convinced them. So labor movements and also the trade unions and the labor movements became strong supporters for European integration. And there was in the Maastricht Treaty was also a social chapter which granted social rights and social partner negotiations on EU legislation. But what happened then, these dimensions remained rather weak compared to the economic dimension. The internal market realized it was a big success, actually. In fact, then the financial market got, I didn't say that, in the financial market was not only liberalized within the European Union, but globally. So when the global financial crisis broke out, immediately it could swap over to Europe, and also it was many of the European banks and actors, financial market actors, that had a stake in the crisis also in the US. It's like the German bank, the Deutsche Bank, for example. So in fact, what role has the crisis? It actually accelerated this whole tendency, and the negative consequences of the integration and the negative consequences of globalization. So there was it led to more social cutting, more social flexibilization of working conditions, more liberalization and deregulation. So in fact, the European Union did then not protect the citizens, but actually contributed even to the crisis. And I'm going to show also, additionally, showed a very incompetent crisis management. It was doing actually a muddling through. It was nothing that has to do with a professional crisis management. And this has to do because, in fact, we have an economic and monetary union, which in reality is only a monetary union. When the crisis broke out, we saw that actually the architecture of the economic and monetary union has major flaws. It has the internal imbalances, and before the crisis, we believed that the south of Europe is catching up. There was big growth, big financial flows from the north going to the south, a big boom, construction boom, tourist boom, services boom. But when the bubble burst, it led to the situation that these countries had a big public debt. Second, there was no instrument and tools in place to tackle with external shocks. And also with the possibility that there could be a sovereign default of an EU member state was actually never thought of. It was unthinkable. So it became a big shock, and there was no institution that was foreseen as a lender of last resort, because actually the ECB explicitly was forbidden to do this. Now we see economic and monetary union. Is it because the European Union is too supranational? In fact, in economic and monetary union, there's only one part that is supranational. It's the monetary policy. The monetary policy, but indeed, is not being done by the council, by the head, the ministers. It's being done by the central bank. It's been delegated to the European Central Bank. Additionally, the European Central Bank is independent, so outside of political influence taking, and additionally, it has only the one main criteria, stability oriented, inflation, fighting inflation, and only if they can succeed that, they can think about growth policy and others. So it's different to the Federal Reserve, which has also an employment criteria, objectives. And last thing, but not least, it has an accountability to the European Parliament, but this accountability only means the president of the ECB comes regularly to the European Parliament and talks about the policy, and the Parliament can ask questions, but they cannot change anything. There's no way they can say you have to do this or that. So this basically is just an information. And economic policy, although there is foreseen in the treaties that EU member states should consider their economic policy as of common interest, this was left completely intergovernmental. So there were some targets with the Stability and Growth Pact and the broad economic policy guidelines and so on, but there was also no teeth. So you have to report what you did, and if you did some errors, you were being called a bad guy, but nothing major happened. So even the big member states, France and Germany, they trespassed the 3% deficit criteria, and then they just abolished the sanctioning procedure. And what happened with the global financial crisis? So In fact, the crisis management of the Eurozone was completely intergovernmental in nature, because it's not even economic and monetary union, it's euro area, so only concerns the member state of the European Union, and these structures are completely informal. So they are not like an official part of the European Union structure, and they have no accountability at all, neither on the European Union level nor on the national level. And in fact, when the crisis broke out, they committed a policy that was basically a muddling through. So they were driven by the financial markets to come with quick solutions. There was no rules, and so the strongest can actually prescribe what has to be done, or dictate the strongest to the weakest. Additionally, as I said already, there was a very strong influence of the financial markets. This was already before the crisis, so they made a lot of lobbying and pressure and were in a lot of expert panels, were representatives of the financial markets who convinced that no regulation is the best regulation in the financial markets. When the crisis broke out, there was a bailing out of financial institutions without any conditionality or consequences. And when the government had to fulfill afterwards policies to reduce the deficits that they actually took over because of the bailing out, they were driven by financial markets to do deregulation and flexibilization. So here is maybe more obvious. The Eurogroup, which is the finance minister, is an informal group. There was a big conflict with Varoufakis at that moment. He was criticizing that very much because there was simply no accountability to the European Parliament, nor to the national parliament. Here, maybe I have to make one addition. One could see in Germany that the German parliament was consulted about the terms of bailing out Greece, but in fact, when the Greeks voted and had elections, this had no consequence. They could not have realized the program that they voted on. So, additionally, then what happened? So this informal group that made major decisions on policies in the European Union delegated even to the Troika. Okay. And this Troika is the ECB, the Commission, and the IMF. And just to mention, the European Central Bank, the IMF, and so the European Parliament had a commission which investigated the policies that they did and actually said, okay, this Troika violated EU norms, so they did not follow EU legislation, they violated EU legislation, they did not stick to the objectives of the European Union with Lisbon and Europe 2020, the Charter of the Fundamental Human Rights, and the European Court of Justice also criticized, gave them right, and said the Commission and the ECB actually remain EU institutions even if they work within this framework and are bound to the EU law, which they actually did not fulfill. So this is why the European Parliament and the national parliaments, they had a conference, and they came up saying that we have an increasing sense of a double democratic deficit in this enhanced economic governance framework of the European Union, both at EU and at national levels, and we need to find a way that both the European Parliament and national parliaments get an involvement taking into account their respective roles. Okay, I will close to this, but what is obvious that there were policies additionally from this Troika, from the European Central Bank and the Commission and the IMF, that were deeply cutting in the social state, in the welfare states, particularly in the south of Europe. And actually the president of the European Central Bank said, the social model is long gone. Okay, no, I will finish now with saying that, in fact, it showed that for the countries that were debtors countries, there was like they lost the sovereignty. I mean, we can maybe later speak about what happened in Greece and so on. And at the moment, we see that Macron is starting to give an answer and make proposals to go deeper in a reform of the European Union and to democratize up to this Europe Economic and Monetary Union. But at the same time, we can see that nationally, he's actually doing a policy which is more into the old way of competitive social dumping and lowering standards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's increasingly rare that I find myself on a panel that includes the title of Democracy, even if it's crisis, Turkey, and in the contents, and Europe. So it's, thank you for giving me that opportunity. I'll talk about a country that is in a type 1 type of crisis, an acute type of crisis, but perhaps a latently acute crisis as well, because actually it's been going on for a long time. Yes, Turkey has never been considered a consolidated democracy. It has always the military looking over, every now and then stepping in. It's been classified as a tutelary democracy, a hybrid regime, illiberal democracy, delegative democracy, and all of that, but nonetheless, some type of a democracy. And despite that, the speed with which it has declined into a very dark type of authoritarianism has been nothing short of baffling. Especially so when you take into account the previous emerging image of Turkey, which was very much promoted also by the Western security establishment, I would say, which and promoted to the wider region of Turkey's neighborhood as a model of good governance, democratization, and economic growth. But there was some, it wasn't just opportunistic, there were some important and exciting changes happening in Turkey about 10 years ago. It was, or it seemed to be, disassembling the military tutelage that had constrained Turkish democracy for decades. It seemed to be appearing to find a consensus, or at least looking for a consensus for the age-old question of secularism and Islam, how do they go together? So that was a very interesting and exciting seemingly experiment, taking steps towards the European Union membership and addressing some of its most difficult historical and social issues, including the bloody 40-year-old Kurdish conflict. The picture today couldn't be any more different. The Kurdish war is back on full force, perhaps more violently than it was before in the 1990s. The military is clearly not out of politics, as evidenced by the failed coup attempt of July 2016. Rule of law is all but suspended under a draconian state of emergency, which has seen hundreds of thousands of public officials, military officers, police, judiciary members purged from the state, and thousands of them put in prison alongside journalists, academics, human rights activists. A populist strongman effectively has consolidated power through executive aggrandizement and long-term manipulation of the electoral process. Nancy Berman has written about these two as endemic aspects of democratic backsliding in our age. And he's effectively running the country through executive decrees, which the Constitutional Court has declared itself irresponsible for overseeing. We're talking about President Erdogan, who has also recently managed to pass through a very controversial referendum, and accepted a proposal for establishing an executive hyper-presidentialism that may perhaps be compared to the most liberal examples of Latin America, perhaps even exceeds it. Speaking of Latin American comparisons, you might remember that not so long ago, Turkey was very much, quite frequently compared to Brazil. And up until the June 2013 protest in both countries, of course. But then it seems like the two countries have diverged their paths. Neither of the countries has really gone to a good place, but they've chosen their own crappy paths, it seems. But nowadays, the only comparison you can find Turkey and Brazil is in the list of the most rapidly devaluing currencies. If there is a President Bolsonaro, God forbid, we can go back to some Turkey and Brazil comparisons. In fact, the emerging comparison between Turkey, if there is to be one in Latin America, is that of Venezuela. And it is not just a scholar proposing it. You might also find it in the news. Just last weekend, Nicolas Maduro was on a high-profile state visit to Ankara, where he praised Turkey as a new emerging power in the world, and the two sides talk about this new period of friendship in the years to come. So, how to make sense of such a dramatic descent, which even the Turkish government's most ardent critics couldn't really foresee? I mean, in terms of its dramatic speed and violence. What was the cause? What were the causes? Was there a massive economic crisis? Well, actually, Turkey's economy has continued to do surprisingly well, even as its democracy deteriorated rapidly. In fact, Jason Brownlee observed in March 2016 that Turkey could be a theory-busting case for the famous theory put forward 20 years ago by Professor Limonji and Adam Jaworski about wealthy democracies not going to dictatorship. And Turkey fulfilled both elements of wealth and democracy for that. I wish Professor Limonji was here. We would love to converse about it. Economy matters, but maybe not just GDP per capita. What is it then? Is it resurgent nationalism? Well, nationalism has always been a parcel of Turkish society and politics. Is it populism? Partly, yes. Erdogan fulfills all the typical stereotypes of a populist leader. But if so, why did it all of a sudden emerge? I mean, Turkey has been governed by the same government for ruling party for 50 years. Erdogan was the darling of the West for 10 years. What has changed? And in any case, I tend to think that populism should be seen not only as a cause of our discontents, but as an outcome of our discontents. Is it the mixture of Islamism with neoliberalism, which seems to be the poisonous concoction? Well, 10 years ago, there were analyses praising conservative liberalism of Turkey as the magical mixture. So that existed back then as well. So there needs to be something else to add up, perhaps, to this entire list. And my suggestion in a paper we wrote for this special issue I have with me on Turkey's exit from democracy with a colleague from the University of Graz is focuses on the notion of existential insecurity. Existential insecurity understood as the fear and suspicion of political and physical annihilation of political actors. And I'm not here only talking about an opportunistic use of an insecurity discourse to mobilize the masses, which there is that for sure, but I'm also talking about one that is actually inherently felt by political actors themselves. The belief that in order to survive, you have to dominate or annihilate the other party, and not just electorally, judicially, and perhaps even physically. This goes contrary to the basic democratic idea that democracy is a system where incumbents lose elections, and when they they leave office. Because all you lose is your office, and you can contest it in another election. On the contrary, it's an all-or-nothing mentality that infuses a zero-sum effect into politics, making power sharing or relinquishing power and compromise seemingly suicidal. You cannot take a step back. Therefore, virtually impossible. I would say that a minimum level of existential security is a sine qua non of democracy, alongside elections. You might say that insecurity also existed in Turkey before, didn't it? and it rendered Turkey's institutions, democratic institutions, weak and justified its authoritarian structures. And this would be correct, with a major difference. In the Cold War environment, we could say that insecurity was managed, contained, in a tutelary democratic setting for the purposes of regime maintenance in a relatively predictable geopolitical environment. Whereas what's happening since, as an aftershock or delayed after effect of the post-Cold War environment, perhaps since the mid to late 2000s, is that insecurity has been exponentially increasing on the basis of overlapping systemic crises on two levels. On the level of the regime, on the domestic level, and on the regional, which has affected and has basically influenced Turkey and increased insecurity. Let me explain briefly what I mean by these overlapping crises. First one, the domestic level, is a regime crisis. The existence of, since the early 2000s, an increasingly vicious hegemonic struggle for the reins of the state between rival social political actors. A crisis and a struggle to basically change the regime or maintain it. The first phase of it, between 2002 until 2011 perhaps, was between the Kemalists and the Islamists, very roughly. The references involved in this increasingly sort of existential struggle were very historic, going back to the Ottoman sort of era resentments and the foundation of the Republic. It featured attempts of foiled coups already, 2003, 2004, closure attempts for the ruling party, the Justice and Development Party, and a military ultimatum in 2007, and then afterwards retaliated by the Islamists via two high-level court cases to basically root out Kemalists from state institutions, especially the military. This was, in fact, mistaken or taken at the time as by Turkish liberals, but also by the European Union, as a nasty but a necessary part of the democratization process. Some sort of a birth pang of democracy. It had to happen. In fact, it was killing democracy. In hindsight, we can say that it had little to do with democracy, but with power struggle and survival. The second part of this regime crisis happened once the Kemalists were out of the fray. The military, the secular military was marginalized, and the ruling Islamists, the two constituent parts of the ruling Islamists, Gülenists, if you know them, and Erdogan, fell into each other in an even more vicious manner, featuring high-level corruption cases, even more systemic and deep-running purges. And this process was even more damaging and more paranoia-inducing than the previous regime struggle between the Kemalists and the Islamists, because between the Kemalists and the Islamists, you could tell who was who. They dressed differently, they spoke differently, they came from different backgrounds, they had different ideologies. But the Islamists themselves didn't have these distinctions, so they couldn't know who was with them and who was against them, which led to an incredible increase in paranoia in the state, within the state institutions, leading to a step-by-step decrease into a sort of type of existential insecurity that was debilitating, for which the 15 July 2016 coup attempt was only a step. So basically, it was a step in this process of a downward spiral. The outcome of this has been a systematic violation of rule of law. For what it's worth, it existed. This predictability of law existed in Turkey previously. A gradual erosion of the democratic process and manipulation of the process. Institutionalization of extreme paranoia. And extensive purges that reduce state capacity to debilitate the extent. The consequences of this hegemonic struggle may not have been as damaging had it not been for the simultaneous regional crises, both of which affected Turkey. and both of which had happened in Turkey's own neighborhoods. One, the democratic backsliding in the West, especially in Europe. I'm talking here about the rise of populist movements in the EU and the loss of EU's normative influence on Turkey, which had acted as some sort of an anchor for liberal democratization. But more directly, the role of the EU in enabling this process of hegemonic struggle to start with the accession process, but leaving it halfway without it being reaching the conclusion. It's as if, like, when you start a psychotherapy session, you pull apart the patient, and then you leave without putting them back together. And that was her main responsibility in the case of Turkey. And on the other side, a systemic meltdown, a wildfire taking place in the Middle East, which links the local existential struggle with a regional and even global one, and deepening it. And you see a deep, sort of a real deepening of existential insecurity after 2013, a sense of betrayal of the government by the West, that they left us and they want to overthrow us. The Gezi protests is a part of a conspiracy of 2013 to overthrow the government. The Egyptian coup against Muslim Brotherhood and led Mohammed Morsi government, very close ally of the AKP government, just in the Development Party government, showed to the Turkish government that if they felt nobody in the West would cry, it would shed a tear. And finally, the turnaround in the Syrian war, which was against all expectations of the Turkish government. Flooding in of millions of Syrian refugees, and Turkey turning into a jihadi army. The gains of the Kurdish Syrian Kurds, so on and so forth. All of these factors have contributed to a certain outcome. One person has has emerged as the winner, Erdogan, but has he really won? He's no longer in a position, he is alone at the top of the state hierarchy, but no longer in a position to share power or step back. Any backward step is considered a step towards annihilation. And the proof of it, I would say, closing here, is the 2015 repeated elections in 2015, when for the first time in 13 years, the governing party lost its parliamentary majority, but refused, through a manipulative process of actually acknowledging the results of the elections, and through a very different social political environment, which included creating a conflict with the Kurds, renewed the elections and made sure it won back its parliamentary majority. The official discourse of the regime is now something like the war for apocalypse, the second war of independence, terrorists and foreign agents against the national government, and everybody needing to line up behind the leader. It is deeply paranoid, deeply insecure, deeply, of course, aggressive. It would be considered a road to fascism. What else if this isn't it? So that's where we see Turkey today, and I guess we could talk about where in question and answer, if we have any time, what does that mean for the liberal democracy's ability to prevent itself or prevent a country from succumbing to such levels of existential insecurity and going deep into authoritarian levels as Turkey.
I'd like to open the floor quickly, although we are going to first have the break, but I think it's more excellent panel, so there must be a lot of questions. Are you meaning?
Yeah, it's very convincing.
Just start the cake.
It's very convincing, this argument about how convergence produces space for populism. But when you think about, well, there is a paradox here, because when you think about convergence, is a process through which the social democracy went a little bit towards the right. And when you read the British Third View people, and also say, what they are saying, they say there has been transformations in the British society, and the party must adapt if it wants to win elections. It was an electoral strategy, actually. And it worked. And so, what happened afterwards with a successful electoral strategy? How it's not an invention, it's not a perversion, it's a kind of rational movement trying to adapt the social democracy. What was seen as huge social transformations. For Bettina, I don't know if I got you right, but in the beginning of your presentations, you kind of related increased inequality to non-represent. This perhaps is so in United States, in Europe. This is not so in Latin America. We are the winners of globalization. If you look the curve, the elephant curve of Branko Milanovic, we are with India more than we are there in the span of relevance. So, how can you think of your argument outside Europe, outside the places where you had increase in inequalities? Of course, inequalities in Latin America were much huger than in Europe from the beginning. But anyway, the people who went to the streets in São Paulo, they were the winners. The situation has improved. And I think also in Chile, you could say the same. And finally, for Cara, what we are seeing in Turkey and in Venezuela is that produced from the government. It's not a pressure of the military outside, it's the government producing the debilitating democracy. In Venezuela, I think an important element was an illiberal ideology. The paranoid discourse and all that is there, but fundamentally you have a vision that pluralism is not acceptable. They have from the beginning an illiberal ideology. We must stay here because we represent the people and the others are enemies of the people. And then now we have some kind of paranoid discourse also. But I think that the issue is a kind of not liberal ideology. And I would ask you, has this any relations to liberalism or not?
Any more? Any other questions?
First of all, thanks for the presentations. They were truly wonderful. I have one quick question for Cara. This idea of the existential threat that I find very interesting. It seems to me that at some level this is endogenously created, right? The existential threat, I think, is another way of rephrasing Maria Arminius. Existential threat emerges because someone with power tells you that they are not going to negotiate with you, and eventually they are going to take over your whatever space you have in terms of power. So that creates existential threat, and of course that triggers a security dilemma, because then you are going to try to preemptively attack. Right? And so the question at some level is, so what triggers at some point in time the activation of existential threat against that?
And then
a quick comment on Maria Hermine, and the comment is it's not related to Milanovic study. It's not that much or not alone the question of how the globalized wealth is distributed among nations. It's also very much about the internal distributional structure within society, and at least if it comes to OECD countries, what we have seen during the last 3 decades, it's a clear increase of inequality. within the OECD countries. And if this is true, and it is true, it is all OECD studies are showing this, one can relate it to some extent what Jan-Werner was talking about the emergence of right-wing populism. And to some extent this is missing for me. That you warned us at the beginning that you will not talk about that much about causes, what caused the emergence of right-wing populism. But if we talk about a weakness of representative institutions, obviously there was a growing segment of the population, now I'm talking about the OECD countries, a growing segment of the population which did not, at least subjectively, feel represented. And this weakness of representation certainly has two dimensions. The one is the economic exclusion, and the other one is a kind of cultural, discursive exclusion. And this was to some extent driven by the move, the centripetal move of the center-left and center-right catch-all parties. They simply open political space. And opening political space means that the people who are in these spaces do not feel represented. And so we should be a bit more self-critical, we as cosmopolitan, liberal, multicultural Democrats, that there might be also, this has also be a reaction against, and here this is my last point, against a certain moralistic hegemony in discourses. You were talking about this kind of moral and politics of right-wing populists. But if we look back, what the liberals did, moving away from socio-economic question in a kind of cultural term, meaning focusing on identity politics, gender, transsexual, sexual preferences, ethnic minorities, and so forth. And there are good normative reasons for it. But this was liberal identity politics, and now we have a kind of reaction. This is nationalist, populist identity politics. And one has to see the dynamic between the two in order to at least provide one piece of explanation.
I close here. I have a lot of questions myself, but I will.
It's only one question to Professor Miller. Do you think that in the United States specifically, the question of automation of industrial production in states like of the Rust Belt, which role does this play to the rise of populism? Specifically when, if you look to liberal cities and states, there are jobs, high-paying jobs in different sectors. Did that cause a certain distrust between the two sides?
I'm sorry.
Okay. So I have one of the questions from Maria Hermine, and it's true that the development is opposite, and I would just remind you because I didn't have the opportunity to show it. But in the European Union, actually, we had in Greece, for example, youth unemployment then as a consequence of this crisis went from 67% in 2013, and in Spain was slightly under 65. And these are young people, very often not uneducated. Often, I mean, when I was working in the parliament, we had stagiaires, unpaid stagiaires that had already done a stage in the United Nations, then the European Parliament, and cannot find a job, and 2 or 3 masters internationally. So they lose like 10 years. It's a lost generation. Only now the economy is going up. So they actually, you mentioned also, part of their existence is really destroyed through these developments. And how I see the development especially in 2013 protest movement in Brazil, is much more like a maturation of democracy, because Brazil was actually number 7 world economic power, was overtaking the UK, and was now asking, and actually more people were traveling and could see in other states, rich states, why can't we have an efficient and good public service, hospitals, universities, and so on. And I think they were asking for this. I see. And I saw it positive. I didn't feel it threatening. I saw it a positive. And I want to maybe take up also the issue about the socially excluded and the space, the gap that was left to the extreme right. I saw an interesting documentation on ARD, on the German television, on the non-voters and the voters' abstention, which showed a study of University of Osnabrück, where they investigated the probability that wishes or demands of low social groups, so low-income social groups, as compared to middle and high-income groups over the past 15 years. And then the results showed that there's a very low probability that the low social income groups, their wishes are being fulfilled in politics, non-regarding which political party was in power, if it was social democratic or conservatives. So it means for me that they were not represented, even if they would vote for them, but their wishes were not put on the agenda. And then you have, of course, a lot of exactly this class that went into the movement of non-voting and then voting more radical. And I think it is not surprising that it's actually the Social Democrats that are losing the most in Europe, because they were part of governments that contributed to these liberal policies where there were losers created, and they didn't take care. So why would you vote for them if they don't do anything for you?
On social democrats. So let me try to give two answers at the level of strategy, party politics, and then one more on, again, the level of democratic theory. So on the level of party politics, of course, you're absolutely right, that at the time these seem to be smart adaptations to a kind of new world. But, first of all, you pay a price when things might change and you have to re-establish your credibility as a distinct party of the left. And we've seen many cases where social democratic parties have not managed that. Most recently, last month in the German elections. In Britain it kind of worked, but basically it was somebody fighting with his own party and still fighting with his own party, and basically against the background of an image where it seems like it's an outside movement momentum that is hijacking the party. And I mean, I'm not a consultant, I'm not a PR person for parties, but I think it kind of raises the stakes of what you have to say in terms of re-establishing credibility. If you push me, I would say social democrats need the equivalent of the wall in terms of sending a very strong signal of commitment. I'm serious about X. If the German social democrats want to win, it's not enough if the leading candidate says it's time for justice. Apparently nobody believes that. If he had said, I'm just making this up, we're going to put somebody from Volkswagen in prison because of what they did, maybe we'll change the game. I'm just saying. The other thing is simply that, of course, if you adapt in a certain way, you simply reinforce an existing hegemony. So, again, you ultimately are playing into the hands of the other side, which is exactly what you said vis-a-vis social democrats looking back now. But on the level of democratic theory, I think there is a deep problem with the kind of rhetoric that suggests here is a reasonable center and dissent is not truly legitimate. And we're witnessing another experiment in this right now because Macron's approach is, of course, a second coming of the third way, so to speak. Here is a reasonable center, that's why we can be bipartisan, that's why I can appoint people from the left and the right. Lots of people can be in that center, but whatever is left is disqualified as right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism. And especially if that project is seen to fail in certain ways, I think it's bad news for a democracy as a whole. back to representation gaps. So I don't disagree with the basic idea that the parties move, and then some people feel we're no longer, identified with this party. It opens up space for somebody else. What puzzles me, and it's a genuine puzzle, I'm not making a polemical point, is why some of the actors who then fill the gap feel the need to be populist in my sense of anti-pluralist. You could imagine that somebody says, forgive me for being so Euro and especially German-centric, the Christian Democrats have abandoned, a truly conservative stance on family policies, they've abandoned nationalism and so on. We now have 7% of people who believe in this stuff very strongly, and they deserve a party to the right of the Christian Democrats. Okay. And people who have already not been voting for several years go back to the polls. It's easy to say in a certain way that's a gain for representation, that's a gain for democracy. But if at the same time the leaders of, let's say, that new imaginary party keep saying, we want our people back, and this whole democracy is a facade, and it's like in the late GDR, and everything is a fraud, and so on, then I think we cannot simply say, oh, it's obviously a gain for democracy, because that kind of rhetoric is quote-unquote not normal. So, beyond the banal explanation that some of these people, of course, start out as anti-system because they might really feel there's no place in the system for us anymore, and beyond the banal explanation that once they've succeeded on the basis of these claims, they persist with them. By which I mean that, of course, Marine Le Pen is not going to wake up tomorrow and say, guys, I was just kidding, all the other parties are okay, they fight for their interests, we fight for our interests, I was exaggerating when I said that, UMPS is all the same and so on. Of course, she's not going to say that for very banal reasons, but I think this is still something that needs to be explained and that ideally one should also fight. And maybe one way one could fight it, but that's a very theoretical point, I haven't seen this in practice anywhere, but it was kind of recently tried by the Austrian Social Democrats, who basically said, okay, we will not forever exclude a coalition with the official right-wing populists, if you like, but we're going to have a catalog of criteria. So whoever doesn't fulfill these criteria, we kind of have a coalition with. And then if these people don't adapt in certain ways, they also can't complain, and it's more transparent for voters. So it's not so easy to say that, oh, this is a cartel, that the same parties always hold on to state resources. You could basically give it more of a choice. I mean, it's a very theoretical, pious hope that, this is going to work out. But in theory, I think it could be the right approach, because at one level, it would at least give these populists an incentive to say, look, if you really want to be in government, here's sort of what you would have to do. If you don't do it, okay, but then don't complain that even though you get the most votes, we're not prepared to kind of do a coalition. Last thing, liberal identity politics. I wish we had 3 more hours to debate this. Frankly, I'm skeptical about the implied trade-off. I don't see why doing basically advancing the rights of minorities has to come at the expense of something else. And I think empirically the case has not been made that this has recently cost anybody any elections. I mean, all we know about 2016 at this point is that what was reported about Hillary Clinton, the topics that were associated with Hillary Clinton were not, with all due respect, transgender bathrooms. This is a myth that people, the white working class said, I'm not going to vote for her because she sticks up for these minorities. No, it's because she was associated in terms of topics and what she stood for with email scandals, the foundation, Benghazi, and all this other stuff as topics did not play a real role in that election. So beyond that, also, I'm slightly puzzled what it means now to sort of move away from that. So we're not going to protect minority rights now. Or, we'll be more nationalist a little bit, but how exactly? So,
This is Jan-Werner, this is a theoretical question you are posing, a normative question. I completely follow you. But why should the lower third of the population think like you? And this is an attack. I don't follow completely your description that they are anti-pluralist. This is, again, an ideal, typical construction of a right-wing populist. They are prepared to coalesce with other parties. They did it 5 or 6 of the West European countries. It's too easy for us just to say they are anti-pluralist. They are for closing the border, but they are accepting basically the rule of the game. This makes them probably more dangerous. They are not outright, as you said, anti-system party in the Sartorian sense. They are semi-loyal, maybe. And they're moving, indeed, the whole political landscape to the right. Here I agree. Maybe we should look much more specifically to these different countries. At least the right-wing populists in Scandinavia and Switzerland, they are classical reactionary parties mobilizing with populist methods, but they are not anti-system parties.
If I may, just one quick reaction. I mean, it's good to have a debate, obviously. So I agree with you completely that one needs to look at specific national contexts. I mean, even though on one level what I'm describing sort of ends up looking the same, of course it doesn't mean that it has the same causes. I mean, the reasons for the rise of a Jörg Haider are not the same as the reasons for the rise of a Le Pen or the triumph of Trump and so on. I completely agree that this is always the danger of homogenizing these cases. But also notice one thing, I haven't said anything about the 1/3 of society. I'm making no assumptions about the actual voters. I'm not saying they're anti-pluralists. I'm not saying they're all, what's the word, deplorables. I'm not saying that at all. I think it's a big mistake, both on a strategic but also on a normative level, to pretend that we know anything about these people. No. Who knows? Okay. We can find out to some degree, but we cannot, in a sense, morally disqualify these people, partly also because then we do exactly what I'm criticizing populists for. I'm basically saying, because you exclude, we now exclude you in turn. I think it's absolutely the wrong way to go. But I also worry about these sort of views taking hold that, okay, so there's 1/3 of people who basically don't like minority rights. You didn't say that, but I think in the US right now, it's very clear that plenty of Democrats are basically saying, how are we going to reach the moderate Trump voter? And then it's clearly code for the strategy of, let's go easy on minority rights, let's be a little bit more nationalist, maybe occasionally even a bit of dog whistling, who knows. But this is sort of taken as a factual starting point that everybody has to accept, and it's simply not. Again, purely on the level of strategy, not normative, purely on the level of strategy, as has been shown many times now, if minorities had actually come out for Hillary Clinton, she would have won. If plenty of people in the 3 relevant states would not have voted for a Green candidate, she would have won. It's not obvious that you only can go this one way, and especially it's not obvious that you have to do so on the basis of extremely dubious factual assumptions. So should you do more for the Rust Belt in terms of economic stuff? Of course. Should you now say, there's a trade-off in the liberal identity politics and we have to go easy on minority rights? No. End of campaign speech.
Very quickly, I think I would take both your comment and your question together because with regards to liberalism and Islamism or populism, let's say, I think the AKP gives a good example of a party that changes its mind, or a movement that changes its mind, doesn't resist and try to beat the system from the outside, but go in and basically change it from within by being open to pluralism and being open to the hierarchy of the system. So I would agree that that is more dangerous. At least in the Turkish case, it has been proven. The difference between Turkey and Venezuela was that, exactly precisely on that note, was that the project in Turkey didn't start as an illiberal project. But to what extent there was a sort of inherent, a real sort of, at its core, a marriage of liberalism and Islamism, it seems to have been very superficial. When it comes to the very core of it, it didn't really, it failed the test. So in that sense, Islamism has failed that test of, producing a way of offering a better alternative for Turkey in terms of democracy and pluralism and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the triumph of Erdogan, ironically, has been a disaster for Islam. Not only because he is now associated increasingly with authoritarianism, etc., all these things, but also because in order to survive, we also have to go against so many Islamists. And so many ideological Islamists are now in prison, are being witch hunted, and Erdogan's closest allies now are hardcore nationalists, they're not Islamists. So Erdogan is an opportunist. So it's not that Islamism has been a monolithic idea from the beginning and is still there as such. It's very malleable. And I had one more question, very quickly. What triggers existential threats? I think it's a chicken and egg question a little bit. I don't think we can really come to the root of it, because when you listen to the discourse, there's always a precedent, a previous incident that caused the resentment. I mean, we're talking about, in the Turkish case, going back to the 18th, 19th century of Ottoman era reformation and all that. But more importantly, we can talk about what can end it. And I think there are, there's and this is perhaps the hope aspect of it, there is a choice at times, at critical junctures, that political actors have to make. Whether they will go, take a risk, and actually try to reach out, and perhaps they will get out of that vicious cycle of existential spiraling insecurity, or they will push further and go on for annihilation. Turkey went through this twice in recent years. First one was the 2013 protests. There were voices within the government saying that reach out to the other side. And it will heal the heart differences. Everyone chose not to. And then the 2015 election where he lost the majority. And then, and when you close one door after another, you end up not having any doors anymore. You just have a wall, and there you can't do anything. At this moment, I think we're at that stage where probably it's going to be very difficult for Erdogan or anybody else to reach out to make a new sort of compromise and cohabitation.
Thank you so much. I believe it was an excellent panel. We overstepped the break. I'm sorry, but it was really, I congratulate all of you. Thank you.
Okay, so welcome to the last panel of the afternoon on variants and causes of crisis in Latin America. We have two speakers, Aníbal Pérez-Liñán and Juliano Zaiden Benvindo. So we're going to open with their comments, and then we'll open the floor to questions and discussion.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say that it's a pleasure to be here. It's a great honor to be in this place and in this conference. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's really fantastic. What I am going to present today is part of some work that we have been doing with John Polga at the U.S. Naval Academy on the factors that drive the outcomes of presidential crises in Latin America. And so, to begin, let me point out that if you look at Latin America since World War II, there has been a consistent period of political instability in most countries, in which depending on how you count, but about 40 democratic presidents, I'm not talking about authoritarian presidents, but about 40 democratic presidents were ousted from power in Latin America since World War II. What, of course, is different has changed over time is that if you look at the ways in which those presidents have been ousted from power since World War II, the patterns of the mechanisms by which they have been removed from office have changed. So what you are seeing here is just a timeline in the horizontal axis, and in the vertical axis is you see the probability that presidents in Latin America will be removed from office in one of two ways. One, the red line, the red dotted line, is a military coup, a military intervention, and the blue line is some form of legal mechanism to remove the elected president from office. And by legal, I mean mechanisms that can be constitutionally ambiguous, like an impeachment, which can be, of course, they are always questioned in one way or another, or a declaration of presidential incapacity by Congress, or simply protests in the streets that force presidents to resign. So all of those mechanisms are technically legal, but of course, they tend to be highly contested. What is clear in this graph, and this is not news, is that over time, the risk of a military coup has declined, and it clearly declined after the end of the Cold War. But there has been this substitution effect by which presidents are now being removed by these legal mechanisms. So we are in a period in which the governments continue to be unstable in Latin America, but the democratic regimes are more or less stable because there is no military intervention. Now, this opens two important questions, I think. One is, there has been, of course, a large literature in Latin America about the causes of military coups. There has been a more recent literature about the causes of impeachments. But there are two questions that are interesting when we put the two problems, the two mechanisms together. One is, it seems that impeachments are kind of functional equivalents for old-fashioned military coups. So if that's true, one important question is, are there common causes for the two phenomena? That is, are there common factors that drive both the removal of presidents, both in legal or in illegal ways? That's one question. And the second question that is immediately related to that is, if there are those common factors, then what are the causes that separate those outcomes? Why is it that in the past we had coups and now we have impeachments in a legal way? So this is these two questions are questions that we addressed recently in a paper that was published this year with John Polga, and we essentially identify some conditions that tend to separate, some historical conditions that tend to separate those two outcomes. So, of course, the regional context matters a lot, and this is crucial for the effects of the Cold War. So when we observe a historical period in which there are military coups going on in many countries, then it's more likely that we will see a military coup as opposed to an impeachment in any particular country. So the regional environment matters a lot. The presence of a strong legislative shield, and by that I mean the fact that the president has very strong support from his or her own party in Congress, or sometimes a strong coalition, really makes a difference, in the sense that it's not relevant to explain military coups, but it certainly reduces the risk of an impeachment. So that's one of the factors that prevents one of the possible outcomes, and therefore separates the outcomes over time. And lastly, we find that support for democracy among political elites is crucial, and again, this is central to understand the historical transformation that we see in this figure. And this is not surprising, when elites are more committed to democracy, then they will be unwilling to support a military coup, but they may be willing to support an impeachment if they think that the president has committed a crime. So those variables tend to separate the two outcomes and explain the differences in patterns over time to a great extent. But we also find that there are some factors in common, factors that destabilize presidentialism, irrespective of the outcome and the mechanism by which the president is ultimately removed from office. Among those common factors are economic recessions. Economic recessions tend to destabilize governments, which is not surprising, in all times, irrespective of the outcome. Mass protests tend to destabilize governments, of course. We have seen that in Brazil, of course, recently. And the third factor that destabilizes government is what we call radicalism. And this is the factor I want to emphasize today, and is the aspect that we emphasize in the paper I am presenting today. So the paper I am presenting today builds on this finding of this previous paper that essentially shows that when we have radical elites in the system, and I am going to define this term in a minute, when we have radical elites, governments tend to be more unstable and presidents are more likely to fall through military coups or through impeachment, depending on the historical period. So the topic I want to explore today is the effects of radicalization. So first of all, by radicalism, I do not mean that political leaders or political parties are on the extreme left of the political spectrum. What I mean by radicalism, this is a term that we developed in a previous book with Scott Mainwaring. And what we mean by radicalism is the position that political actors have, political parties, political leaders, trade unions, and so on, the positions that they have with respect to policies. And by radicalism, we mean that those actors tend to adopt, actors that we consider radical, adopt positions that they tend to be extreme in terms of if the system is essentially polarized in terms of left and right, they tend to be towards the left or right of the political spectrum. But that's not really the important, the central aspect of the definition. The central aspect of the definition is that those actors are intransigent. They tend to be, they have very strong policy preferences, and they are very impatient about the realization of those policy preferences, and they are very intransigent, which means that they are very unwilling to accept any form of negotiation with their opponents, or bargaining, or concessions, which makes democratic politics quite difficult. Now, let me clarify that radical political actors could be therefore on the right of the political spectrum, as in the case of some of the populists that we were discussing in the previous panel, but they can also be on the left of the political spectrum. Think about, for example, the discourse of the Venezuelan government nowadays. They can be in government or opposition, a topic that I will discuss in a minute. They can be reactionary in the sense that they oppose any changes of the status quo, or they can be transformative. They may push for transformations of the status quo. And they can also embrace demands that we deem morally unacceptable, or they may embrace demands that we consider very valuable and we defend. So radical actors may be quite different among themselves. What distinguishes them is that they have such a strong policy preferences that they are willing to negotiate. The policy preference become a moral issue. Most importantly, the radical actors can be in government or in opposition, and this is the point I want to discuss today. In the analysis that we did with Olga, we just looked at the general presence of radical actors in the system, and we found that this destabilizes the presidents. However, in the previous work with Scott Mainwaring that I mentioned before, where we defined this idea of radicalism, we found that for political regimes, radical actors in government or in opposition may have different effects. For example, in the case of transitions to democracy, radical governments, radical authoritarian rulers, delay any form of transition to democracy because they are willing to negotiate any liberalization of the system. But radical oppositions, because they tend to destabilize the authoritarian regime, quite often facilitate the transition to democracy, even if they may be pro-democratic or not, but that's a different issue. So what we are doing in this paper with Paul is wondering, well, if radical actors in government and opposition have different impact on political regimes, they may have perhaps different impacts for presidential crises. So we essentially developed two hypotheses. The first one is that when radical actors are in the opposition, they will tend to destabilize presidents in any way possible, depending on the historical context in which they operate. So radical oppositions will use coups when military coups are viable, or they will call for impeachment in historical periods when impeachments are viable. The fundamental insight here is that radical oppositions tend to be semi-loyal oppositions quite often, because if the president, if the government adopts a policy that they consider unacceptable, they will see the government as illegitimate. And because they see the government as illegitimate, they will try to find ways to destabilize the incumbent. So, different historical periods, they will use whatever instruments seem to be more effective for that purpose. In the 1950s and 1960s, they quite often formed a coalition with the military. Now that, given the international context, that's harder to do. So quite often they will call for impeachment, or they will try to they will mobilize protests to force the resignation of the president. Now, so this is kind of intuitive and straightforward. Now, the more interesting issue, I think, is what happens when the government is radicalized, when presidents are the radical actors. And what we anticipate in this case is that when presidents are radical actors, then if they fall, they are more likely to fall as victims of a military coup. The insight here is that radical presidents want to impose their policies at any cost, even if they confront opposition in institutions, in the judiciary, in Congress, public opinion, and so on. And because they have these radical preferences for adopting their policies, they usually engage in what Nancy Romero calls executive aggrandizement. They will try to build up the power of the executive branch in order to gain control over, bypass Congress, to gain control over the judiciary, the bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. And so what this means is that the natural spaces for the opposition to funnel their discontent and their resistance, going back to the discussion about Turkey before, those spaces narrow down. And so any attempt to challenge the president using constitutional mechanisms like impeachment or even street protests becomes much more unlikely to be feasible to begin with, and when it happens, it's very, very unlikely to succeed, because presidents gain control over multiple political spaces. And so what that happens is that triggers a reaction from the opposition, a strategic reaction from the opposition, by which the moderate actors are kind of disempowered, and this is what Linz famously described as the abdication of the moderates, which sometimes they do not abdicate, they just disempowered. And then that means that the more radical actors operating against the president will often try some extreme measures, like a military coup to overthrow the government. Those coups quite often fail, so they failed in Venezuela in 2002, they failed in Turkey in 2016, but sometimes they are successful. Like the coup was successful in Egypt in 2013, for example. So if we have radical presidents, the anticipation is that if they are displaced from power, they will be more likely to be displaced from power through military action. Now, there are, of course, alternative explanations for why coups or impeachments happen. There is the issue of institutions, right, that I mentioned before, whether the president has protection in Congress to prevent an impeachment or not. Protests are a factor destabilizing governments that can play in favor of coups or in favor of impeachment. There are, of course, legacies in the sense that there are arguments about the countries with a past history of coups being more likely to have coups, for example. There is regional diffusion that I discussed before, in the sense that if there are many coups in the region, it's more likely for a country to have a military coup. And of course, economic conditions like recession destabilize governments and create the conditions for impeachment or military action. So there are multiple alternative explanations that we need to keep in mind. So to test our two hypotheses, essentially what we do is we look at democratic years in Latin America, in 19 countries, between 1945 and 2010, and that's slightly over 700 observations, country years. And we model the risk of a president being ousted from power through a military coup or through an impeachment or some other form of legal removal as competing risks models. That is, essentially, we are having survival models in which presidents can be removed from office in one way or another if they complete their terms, or if they survive in any given year. They are treated as censor cases. So we have a model in which a regular competing risks model, which is essentially like a multinomial logic, and then we have a model in which we have random effects, conditional phrases. And the dependent variable is trichotomous. The president may survive at the end of the year. He or she may be removed through a coup, or he or she may be removed through a legal mechanism. The main variable that we have, the main two variables that we have, are the two variables that capture the degree of radicalization among government, the president and his or her allies, and the opposition. And those measures come from my previous work with Scott Mainwaring. Essentially what we did was we hired about 20 research assistants, and we asked them to read the historical literature about each country for different periods, for different historical periods, to identify the main political actors that emerged from that historical literature, and essentially to use a protocol to identify if those political actors had extreme policy positions in terms of the policy space at the time, and if they showed signals of being intransigent or intolerant. And I can give you more details about the operationalization of this later. So essentially we capture the average position of the proportion of radical actors among government actors and among opposition actors. And those are the two main variables in the analysis. Then we have variables that capture legislative support, the president party or coalition share in Congress, levels of social protests, riots, and demonstrations against the government, legacy variables that essentially capture the number of military coups and the number of impeachments over the past 20 years in each country, the international context, the regional context, which captures the number of coups and the number of impeachments in the region, in other countries in the region, over the past 5 years, economic conditions, levels of economic development and growth, and then a time variable to correct for changes in the baseline risk over time. Just to move quickly into the results. What you're seeing here is, I will not torture you too much with the coefficients in the table, but what you are seeing here is the coefficient for the two main variables, government radicalism and opposition radicalism, for two models. The model 3.1 is the model that shows competing risks, and the second model is with frailties. The two models are essentially capturing the same, which is the effect of the variables on the probability of legal removal and the effect of the variables on the probability of a military coup. And as you can see, government radicalism is a separating variable, in the sense that when the government is radicalized, the risk of legal removal doesn't change. If anything, it goes down, but this effect is not statistically significant. But the risk of a military coup increases in both models. So this means that radical governments, if they are removed from office, they are more likely to be removed by a military coup. By contrast, opposition radicalism tends to increase both the chances of a legal removal from office and of a military coup. Radicalized oppositions tend to remove the president from office using whatever means they have at their disposal. There are other variables in the model, and I will not get into many details, that also work as separating or common explanations. So the two separating explanations in blue are the president's party's share of seats in Congress. So if the president's party is very strong in Congress and impeachment is very unlikely, it's less likely, and so this is quite clear. And the second factor that separates the outcomes over time, as I said before, is the presence of military coups in the region. If we have a period in which many countries are experiencing military coups in the region, it's more likely that the country in particular will experience a military coup, and less likely that we'll experience an impeachment. The two factors that tend to be common causes, as I have mentioned before, are demonstrations. Demonstrations against the government tend to increase both the risk of impeachments and military coups, and economic recession, with very low levels of economic growth, with negative economic growth. Both legal mechanisms to remove the president and military coups tend to be more likely. Just to give you a sense of what this means in terms of concrete risks, and to conclude, what we are seeing here is two plots which show the predicted probability, the predicted risk of a legal removal from office, or the predicted risk of a military coup based on the models that I showed you before. And what you have in the horizontal axis in both panels is the number of demonstrations against the government in any given year. So the predicted values here essentially show you that as demonstrations increase, the risk of a legal removal will increase, through impeachment, for example, but also the risk of a military coup will increase. Now, in the two panels, in the two simulations that I am showing here, we are assuming, for the sake of the simulation, that all political actors, government and opposition, are moderate actors. So demonstrations increase the risk of presidential instability in any of both types, but the risk remains relatively low. Now, if we now do the same simulation, but assuming that the opposition is radical, the government is moderate, but the opposition is radical, what we observe is that the predicted probabilities, the risk of a legal removal still goes up with more protests against the government, when people are unhappy against the government. But the risk of coup also goes up in a much more clear way, which means that radicalized oppositions are willing to use military coups if necessary to satisfy the demand, the popular demand, to get rid of the government. The more interesting difference, however, takes place when we consider that not only the opposition is radicalized, but also the government is radicalized. And this is the third set of graphs. When you look at this set of graphs, when all actors are radical, now more demonstrations tend to increase the risk of a legal removal through impeachment. And this is similar to the first graph, however. But what really increases now is the risk of a military coup. So when the government is radicalized, it seems that the government is closing down opportunities for an impeachment, and is therefore forcing the opposition, the radicalized opposition, to use a military coup as the most likely mechanism. To conclude then, we need to develop, and we are starting to see theories that treat military coups and impeachments together as part of the same theory. So we need theories that explain the resolution of democratic crises through constitutionally ambiguous mechanisms like impeachment and unambiguous mechanisms like military coups. It's clear that those theories need to give us an explanation for why those outcomes happen differently in different historical periods. Clearly, the regional context is an explanation for why those factors are separated in different periods, and the capacity of presidents to give the legislative shield helps explain why sometimes impeachment do not happen, and the only resolution, if the president is going to be ousted, will be a military intervention. Also, we need to identify common causes. In particular, economic recession seems to destabilize governments in general, and mass protests seem to destabilize the governments in general. But what we are finding in this particular work, this novel, is that government radicalism operates as a separating mechanism. When governments are radicalized because they engage in executive aggrandizement, a civilian outcome, an impeachment, is much less likely, and the opposition is forced to use a military venue if they want to overthrow the government. By contrast, opposition radicalism is a common cause. Radical oppositions tend to destabilize governments in any way possible. So the conclusion I want to emphasize is that to understand some of the outcomes that we are observing for crises of democracy nowadays, it's very important to understand contextual factors like the economy and the international context, but we also need more sensible theories about the role of political actors and their policy preferences. Thank you very much.
Sorry, we have to leave this, right?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate here in this such a great panel. And I always say it's a different environment when I'm a lawyer actually, as a not actually a political scientist. So sometimes it's intimidating to be among political scientists because usually lawyers are much more normative when they explain the phenomenon of our reality than the political scientists who are much more empirical and bring in different perspectives about the political phenomenon. Well, anyway, my talk today, the title is quite general. I can say it's just conceptual constitutional change in Latin America. And I come to this title because last year, especially because of the impeachment process here in Brazil, I usually every other month I write to iConnect, which is the blog of International Journal of Constitutional Law. And something that struck me as quite interesting there is that how fast was the idea of impeachment changing at that time. So, and actually it's a kind of a concept which is very complex, and there was this discussion whether it was legitimate or not. And focus on that, I just saw that maybe the speed how things change and the concepts of that we usually use in constitutional law, and maybe, I don't know, maybe we should see whether they really change or not over the years. So the idea here was first to see, to see whether we can develop a kind of a framework of how these changes are taking place somehow, especially concepts which are very connected to Latin American development recently. So, and for that I use first this Heinrich Koselleck, who's a very famous German historian. He has this book Begriffsgeschichte, which is a very famous one, and he examines how concepts change over history. So the idea here is he has the idea of temporality is multi-leveled and is continuously being accelerated and decelerated at distinct speeds. Concepts should thereby be explored in their key meanings in distinct historical periods. History is a very important thing, is that it's very complicated to examine the change of a concept in a very short period of time, of course. So, especially the impeachment of the last year and the other aspects, of course, other concepts, I cannot, of course, bring a serious analysis of how it has changed over the years in a short period of time. But I can maybe examine a more, maybe a broader period and see whether they've changed or not. So, based on that, and I just some other aspects like history is marked by conflicting rights and interests among social groups, leading to distant interpretation of the reality. History also depends on the resource of those who will tell the life story. History is above all discourse, and as such involves with language. This is somehow okay. Of course, there are some aspects which are quite obvious here. But anyway, I think it's important to mention that there's a very interesting theoretical background on how concepts change over the history, and I especially based my perspective on Heinrich Koselleck. I'm just struggling here with both my computer and the show. But why Latin America? So change and stability in Latin America. First, we know that Latin America is a region rich of constitutional experiences, political stabilities, and continuous struggle between development and social inequality. The second thing is many Latin American countries had a little or no democratic experience before 1990. So democratizing pressure became more evident. Third, transitions from dictatorships to democracies gained momentum in different Latin American countries from the 1980s onwards. So Latin America has more than 200 years of constitutionalism. It's an important aspect to mention. But even though it has a long history of constitutionalism, it has a very little short period in history of democratic moments. And based on that, I focus on some concepts which are normally associated with Latin America and the history. One of them is hyper-presidentialism. So we have a very famous Argentine scholar, Roberto Lagarella, who published quite recently a book on Latin American constitutionalism. And his main thesis is that Latin American is, maybe the stability of Latin America is based on this hyper-presidentialism, which is quite controversial statement. Of course, it's not that. There are a lot of other scholars who say that it's, the presidentialism is a point, but it's not that determinant of how Latin America has been so unstable. Another concept which has other aspects which might be interesting is that long-standing centralized tradition. Latin America, we know, of course, especially the Constitution of the 19th century, they were very inspired by the American model, but they in a very particular way, and they changed a lot from that. So it's interesting how different they are nowadays in comparison to what they were at that time. But one aspect that maybe connects all the countries that they have a long centralized tradition. Institutional weakness. Yes, this is something that might be important. So of course, this is normally very well portrayed in many political science, that in Latin America there is a lot of institutional weakness. But it's also something that, especially from some years ago to today, they had. We can say that some countries in Latin America, not all countries, but some countries in Latin America have developed better and much better institutional systems framework. Focus on social rights is something very important. Most of the constitutions in Latin America, they have a strong focus on social rights, which doesn't mean that social rights are really respected here, but this is something that is very normal, which is quite interesting. There's a very interesting empirical study by David Law from the Washington University at St. Louis, and it says, it just like here shows how social rights usually are much stronger in constitutions which don't constitutions from countries which don't respect social rights in reality. So there's a kind of contradiction between text and reality. And the other thing, constitution making strongly based on compromise and bargains leading to international contradictions, inability to deal with the worst case scenario. This is of course a normal procedure in many countries where you have this transition to democracy. It's not only something particular in Latin America. But anyway, the thing is, the process of constitution making in Latin America is much more. Many scholars say, and especially in Latin America, the scholars who wrote pieces at the political science in 1990, Francis Hogopian and Schmitter and a lot of other, this idea of we had a lot of bargains, and the future of Latin America is kind of doomed to failure. Okay, so this is the idea. The similarities I just changed a little bit, and something new. Sorry, it's not going. Okay, what's going on here? One thing that might interest, just to contradict that first impression, is that executives' strong lawmaking powers. This is something that really happens. This is empirical analysis by Ginsburg and Schabel. They say, yes, the Constitution in the last years in Latin America, they got much stronger lawmaking powers. But on the other hand, this is not necessarily bad. So sometimes it can be really good. And there's this idea that presidents can be bad. For example, like Gagarella mentioned, this is not actually empirically necessarily true. So this is an idea which, okay, we had a stronger lawmaking powers. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. The process of democratization in the region, of course, it makes, if you look from the political science from the 1980s and 1990s, and you see what happened in the Latin American overall, we're going to see that prediction that we would be so bad nowadays. Okay, they had a point there, but I think the development of Latin America overall was much better than actually portrayed by those scholars in the 1990s. So there is something important here, because the process of democratization, you can see most of the countries in Latin America, they have a kind of process of democratization, which is now, most of the countries, they don't see dictatorships anymore. One thing that is quite important here, just to mention, is that usually Latin America is portrayed by lawyers, constitutional lawyers, as if we had a homogeneous constitutional system, which is totally wrong. I'm writing right now a piece on constitutional amendment, constitutional replacements in Latin America. It's impressive how different the constitutional designs constitutional frameworks that America are. You cannot, for example, compare the 1853 Constitution in Argentina, which was revised in 1994, with our Constitution in Brazil. It's totally different framework. And if you go just Chile and Paraguay, or Uruguay, you're going to see that their framework are very different one from the other. So it's quite wrong to say we have a similar system of constitutional design, which normally is portrayed by many scholars. I've made this revision of literature. And if you go look at the constitutions specifically, you're going to see their designs are very, very, of course, there are a lot of connections, but they are not as similar as normally portrayed by the scholarship. And one thing that's quite important to mention is also the judicial review. Judicial review, you normally think of Latin American, or actually there's a global trend of judicial review in the world. So we think of Supreme Courts as the new maybe guardian of constitutionalism and democracy. And actually, when we look at Latin America specifically, we're going to see that this is not totally true. We have some countries, of course, that we have this rising role of Supreme Courts like Brazil, like Chile. But other countries, you don't see Supreme Courts making any role. For example, in Mexico, for example, it's very, very tiny. In 2011, they had something there, but it's not compared to what we have, for example, here. There might be something related to the PRI, which is in the power for more than 80 years there. And even in other countries, even in Argentina, for example, you see how the Supreme Court worked there. I think you cannot compare of how, for example, the Supreme Court in Brazil or maybe in Chile or Costa Rica or other countries. So there are things that are just, there are many aspects here to mention how conflicting views of Latin America maybe play a role. So based on this crazy ideas, I've focused on some concepts which can be drawn from these realities, and just to see whether we can see how they change. So we see Latin America is very controversial paradigm, usually depicted as a common reality. But of course, when you see how controversial it is, it also affects how we see these concepts over history. For one of them, the first one is populism. And here, one aspect which I think is quite important is to see, for example, if there is any difference between populism in the north and populism in the south. So whether, what do we call populism in both regions? So this is something that you normally can say, maybe you say there's the north, immigration is a problem, which is not a problem normally when you see populism here. What can make this difference? And the different populism in the world in history, like populism in the past and populism nowadays, like Chavez, Morales, and old populism, Vargas, Perón in Latin America. So what kind of populism can take from these realities, and whether we can make some connection among them. The other perspective is revolution. Revolution is also a concept which is very complex. Of course, we cannot say revolution quite easily. And it's interesting, for example, revolution is something that our military dictatorship use a lot as something related, or maybe like a very beautiful concept to explain the authoritarian regime. And if you look, for example, in Chile, they enlightened in some parts to say we have a revolution here. So the dictatorships, they manage the concept of revolution in very different ways in Latin America. So this is the idea I focus on how revolution and dictatorships, and revolution and also constitutional change. There's something very particular, for example, how Mexico analyzed the idea of revolution. If you look at the Mexican constitution, for example, they prohibit rebellion in the constitution. This is quite weird because you have a constitution, the 1917 constitution in Mexico, and it stated there that rebellion is against the constitution, and even can be a criminal offense, which is quite weird. And what's interesting, because the former constitution also had that same clause, but when it just was replaced in the 1917, they kept this. So the idea of revolution against constitutionalism, or whether actually it became the Constitution of 1917 was the result of a revolution. So it's quite crazy. And the other idea is revolution and populism, which is somehow related to the idea of a Bolivarian revolution, which you have right now in Venezuela and Bolivia. haven't quite finished political. I'll just go to the other one, which is quite some other. I'll go directly here to presidentialism, which is quite important, I think. Oh my gosh, I'm just a sec. So that's what I meant before, the idea whether presidentialism, which is actually presidentialism, hyper-presidentialism and political stability, and they can make this idea of, for example, impeachment, whether this plays a role. And we have, for example, in a few months ago here in Brazil, the idea of semi-parliamentarism, presidentialism, and political stability. How can we what's actually presidentialism over history in Latin America? Because one thing that is quite interesting is that this idea of hyper-presidentialism, which, for example, Varela mentions a lot in his book, if you look at how the presidential systems are designed in Latin America, they actually not so homogeneous are normally depicted. So this is something, of course, when you look at the history of Latin America, we cannot actually make a common point here as if there was like one only presidentialism. And just something more related to the law, the idea of constitutional formal change, which means constitutional amendment and constitutional replacement. And this is something quite important because we normally see the idea of how to formally change the constitution. We usually think of amendments and constitutional revisions or constitutional replacements. But nowadays, even the concept of constitutional amendments might not be that relevant as yesterday. So one concept which is very important, and what a good friend of mine has written on it, is the idea of constitutional dismemberment. Nowadays, we can of course have constitutional amendments. In Brazil, is one of the I can say winners in constitutional amendment in the world. You amend the constitution three times every year. It's along with Mexico and India, the country where you have more amendments in the world. But the thing is, constitutional amendment, this concept which has been the traditional system of change the constitution, is being used in a new perspective, which is not actually to change something in the Constitution, but actually to change the core of the Constitution. So something more radical. So you use the system of the Constitution, so the procedure of constitutional amendment, to change radically the Constitution. The question is whether this is legitimate or not. Well, if you can change something that is so radical in the Constitution through the rules of the game. So you play by the rules. So you go to the rules of you play by the rules of the game, but you make such a radical change in the Constitution that it might be much more than actually a constitutional amendment. It's just more. It's like, and this is the concept of Richard Albert brings this. It's a constitutional dismemberment. And an example that is quite recently here in Brazil is, for example, that constitutional amendment that radically which frees the annual expenditure on social rights and other aspects. Because especially if you look at the Constitution, which is very socially oriented, and now we have this cap on spending, this of course might be interpreted as a kind of constitutional dismemberment as long as it really kind of prohibits some spending on social rights. And one thing that's important to mention is, I mentioned before, is the idea of constitutionally formal change. And here in particular, judicial review in Latin American history. We normally have this beautiful idea, nowadays actually not that beautiful as before, of judicial review being this garden. And this is something I think is quite important to mention, how over the history, judicial review in Latin America is much more kind of a preservationist strategy of political elites than actually something that is making some progress towards social rights. So judicial review, and of course the differences in different countries in Latin America. So the concept of judicial review is very radically different among the countries in Latin America, and especially over history. Even Brazil, for example, which is something most of you are more aware of how it has developed. we understand judicial review as it is today from maybe 2000 onwards, but not before. No one knew the names of the justices of the Supreme Court. Today, everyone knows the names of the Supreme Court. And this is something very particular because of the idea of judicial review has changed very strongly over the years. So we think judicial review is something natural of the democracy in Brazil right now, and we did not. Especially if you look at the Supreme Court, right after the Constitutional Assembly in Brazil, it was the same Supreme Court of the dictatorship. It didn't change at all. And now it became something so important to Brazil. And in other countries, something quite similar happened. In other countries, it didn't happen at all. So judicial review, which is something very important, a concept for democracy for some, it's not such important concept for many other countries in Latin America. It doesn't matter for some country whether there's judicial review or not. So, and one important maybe theory here is whether the fragmented political system plays a role in how judicial review is actually whether judicial review is strong or weak as a mechanism of defense of the democracy. And it's judicial review and political fragmentation is just what I mentioned. So and strong and weak judicial review, which is the final argument. So. These are the main, just some concepts I've been working on. So, of course, this is a very working paper right now. But the idea is just to focus on some concepts which have played a role in Latin America and see whether they change over the years, how empirically they maybe not as homogeneous as normally depicted by the scholarship. And this is something important to me, which I think, especially from maybe constitutional perspective, and what makes it so important to be here among political scientists is that when we lawyers normally examine the political concepts like, for example, the idea of presidentialism, and when we are confronted by how, especially the political scientists examine this concept, it's impressive how different this is. So even the idea of presidentialism, for example, which is Beccaria is a lawyer, and you just see how the political scientists discuss this topic. We see how maybe this disconnection with reality and all these differences are normally presented. So, well, there's some crazy ideas. I've been writing on this, and this is my page on necessary. And if anyone wants to have other comments on, more than welcome. Thank you very much.